The Guardian talks about a bid to diffuse tensions with these escalating protests. Miatta, this is the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, isn't it? What is he suggesting?
So he is, look, recognising that the protests are gathering momentum and steam and that tensions are high. I think the mayor is trying to think about ways in which it can demonstrate that we ought to act and we can act. So he's suggesting, using his position to try and put pressure on the Met Police over issues like search and stop and search, which we know disproportionately affects people from black and ethnic minority groups, as well as the use of things like tasers. And I think this is completely right, because in the end, the thing that people who are on the streets, the thing that people who are protesting are arguing for is change. And we don't need warm words. We don't need, empathy and sympathy. We need action. So I think it's right that the mayor is trying to show some leadership and show other politicians, it will come onto the Home Secretary in a second, that actually there are ways and ways in which you can respond to this in a way that I think is positive and diffuses rather than escalates tensions.
The Mirror has a double-page spread on this Bristol statue. The mayor's response: I cannot condone the damage, but I cannot pretend any sense of loss for the statue. It was a personal affront. Some suggesting this is a distraction from the core message, but is it an important part of the narrative too, Miatta?
Well, look, I think he sums it up perfectly because, in the end, there is a lot of debate about whether or not the statue should have been pulled down and how it was pulled down. But the core issue was that there was a statue of a slave trader who had traded, over 80,000 African people and prospered from it. And it was something that was being honoured. And I think it is a part of shining a spotlight on our history and educating people about the different aspects of our history. And it's kind of frustrating that more fundamental message is being, if you like, overshadowed by a debate about, the actions of some people and whether or not they should have pulled down a statue. And I think that goes for, any sort of violence, because I think for people who are arguing for change, the thing that is most frustrating is when those core arguments about the issues and the change that needs to happen are obfuscated by a debate about, violence or, action that shouldn't have been taken, rather than the fundamental issues that, we are fighting for.
Is there an appreciation in the Black Lives Matter movement, Miatta, that there is a difference between the policing in the UK that Claire's talking about and that in the US, that policing in the UK is by consensus, or that's how it's designed anyway?
Look, policing in the UK is by consent. I think there is a culture in the US that is, far more, it's a decentralized police force. There are sort of acts of brutality that are kind of, that are far too often. But, I think the issue that people here are trying to make and argue is that there is still systemic racism that's baked into our police force. The fact that, black people are twice as likely to die in police custody, the fact that, black and ethnic minorities are far more likely to be stopped and searched because there's racial profiling, and all of that is a problem. So, it might be a different hue, because I think the policing culture is different in the two countries, but I don't think we should just pretend that everything's fine on this side of the pond. There are issues that need to be addressed, and in the end, you either agree that racism is racism and it needs to be tackled in all its shades and hues, or you don't.
Let's talk more broadly then, Miatta. The protest began in America to get what people saw as the appropriate charges against the 4 police officers implicated in the death of George Floyd. In some respects, that has happened now. So what will happen next, do you think?
Well, look, I think it started about justice about that particular incident, and it has, if you like, developed and expanded and gained momentum about wider economic, social, and equality justice. And so, I think it does have momentum, and it must result in change. But there's a note of caution, because we have been here before. We have had these moments where we see these incidents of the most appalling forms of kind of racism and brutality, and it raises people's awareness, it leads to moral outrage, and it doesn't then translate to fundamental change and reform. And I think, what everyone who is shouting Black Lives Matter want is change, not warm words, not moral anguish or moral anger, but actual change. But that requires concerted effort, and that requires concerted pressure, both from Black people, but also, from non-Black people who've actually stood in solidarity. And I think this is the point to move from, moral anger to, well, actually, what can we do about it? And taking action to dismantle different forms of racism in our different institutions and in the way that things operate. Yeah, look, what is a public health crisis has a massive economic crisis following right behind it. And the sort of job losses that BP are talking about, I think we're going to be seeing across the board. The Office for Budget Responsibility has said somewhere in the region of 2.1 million jobs are likely to be lost this year. Other estimates suggest it could be much, much higher. So this is a huge problem. I think the interesting thing, though, about BP, it's fossil fuel industries we're always going to have to fundamentally transition as we move towards a green transition. So they were always going to have to kind of ramp down and close down. And there's a really critical point about how do we start retraining and supporting the people who are going to have to leave these industries to move on into the industries of the future. And we just can't let people be unemployed and languish. So I think the government very quickly needs to be thinking about retraining and redeploying people. It would have to do that anyway, but I think there's now an urgency against the backdrop of mass unemployment.
Pub gardens could soon open. And just very quickly, Miatta, obviously, that is one industry, the hospitality industry, deeply worried by this.
Yeah, completely. I mean, look, the hospitality industry under huge pressure, and I think there's pressure on the government to think about ways in which the hospitality can be allowed to kind of start operating again. The thing that I took from this was, the government has muted the date of sort of the 22nd of June that pubs will be able to open and serve people in their gardens, but hadn't told the industry. So a lot of pub owners are now desperately trying to meet that target. And there is something about managing the easing and giving people enough forewarning so they can plan for what are huge, huge changes in how they're going to operate and in their business models moving forward.